The playground stretched before Maya Bennett. A patchwork of swings, slides, and the joyful shouts of children. All bathed in the warm afternoon sunlight. To Maya, this wasn't just a playground, it was a sanctuary. Here, she could let loose. Her laughter carried on the breeze as she swung high into the sky or sped down the slide with a gleeful whoop. This place held her happiest memories. Moments of complete freedom. Unbound by worries or expectations. Maya's fingers gripped the cool metal chains of her favorite swing as she kicked her legs to go higher. Her feet reaching for the clouds. Her best friend, Emma Woods, laughed beside her. Her own swing in motion as they competed to see who could swing higher. Higher. Maya, Emma called. Her cheeks flushed as she pumped her legs. Maya grinned, determined to meet the challenge. She soared up, feeling the wind rush past her. A feeling as exhilarating as it was familiar. The steady creak of the swings and the rustling leaves in the trees made her feel at home in a way no other place could. Emma and Maya had been inseparable since their first day at the park a year ago. They met when Maya shyly asked if she could join Emma's game of tag. Emma had agreed with a bright smile. And the two had quickly become best friends. From that moment, they'd been each other's partners in every playground game. Every climb to the top of the jungle gym. And every daring leap from the highest steps of the slide. Their laughter echoed through the park, blending with the cheerful sounds of other children at play. Maya felt a warm glow in her heart as she watched Emma's blonde hair fly in the wind. The playground was their kingdom. And every day they came, it felt like an adventure. Maya closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself drift into the rhythm of the swing. Her body weightless. She felt that nothing could go wrong here. In this little corner of the world that she loved so much. The park wasn't just a playground, it was a place where people gathered and friendships were forged. Maya's parents had always encouraged her to spend her afternoons there, saying that playing with other kids was as important as any lesson she'd learn in school. Her father, Judge Henry Bennett, often spoke about fairness, kindness, and respect. And Maya tried to bring those values to her time with her friends. It was a lesson she carried proudly, though she didn't fully understand what made it so important. That afternoon, as the golden light began to stretch long shadows across the grass, Maya and Emma ran from one playground structure to another, challenging each other to race across the monkey bars and daring each other to climb to the top of the slide. The world felt limitless. "Bet you can't catch me," Emma shouted over her shoulder, darting off into the maze of playground equipment. Laughing, Maya dashed after her, her feet pounding on the soft, sandy ground. She weaved in and out of the jungle gym poles, catching sight of Emma's bright pink sneakers just ahead. In moments like this, Maya felt like the luckiest girl in the world. She had a best friend she could rely on, a safe place to play, and parents who were always there for her. She couldn't imagine anything changing that. As they slowed to catch their breath, Maya noticed a familiar figure watching them from the edge of the playground, Emma's mother, Mrs. Colby. She stood by the bench under a large oak tree, her arms folded, her gaze fixed on the two girls. Maya waved, but Mrs. Colby didn't respond. She simply watched, her face expressionless. Maya shrugged, dismissing it. She was used to Mrs. Colby being a little distant, always seeming preoccupied. Besides, she was too wrapped up in her game with Emma to give it much thought. But later, as they sat on the bench sharing snacks, Maya noticed that Mrs. Colby's eyes never left them. Every time Maya turned to Emma, She could feel the weight of Mrs. Colby's gaze. Cold and unwavering. She brushed it off again. Not wanting anything to spoil her perfect day. "Want to go on the swings again?" Emma asked, wiping cookie crumbs off her shirt. "Of course," Maya said, grinning. They ran back toward the swings, laughing. But as Maya took her place on the seat, she felt a shiver pass through her. For the first time, her safe haven felt just a little less welcoming. She glanced back at Mrs. Colby, who was still watching, her expression unreadable. A shadow of worry flickered through Maya's mind. But she pushed it away. This was her place. Nothing, she thought, could change that. The next few days at the playground were much like the last. With Maya and Emma chasing each other, swinging high, and sharing their favorite snacks. But the feeling of Mrs. Colby's gaze was harder for Maya to ignore. It became a constant presence, prickling at her whenever she glanced in that direction. Sometimes, Mrs. Colby would speak with other parents, and Maya noticed them casting brief, sidelong glances her way. She didn't understand why. But a strange unease began to settle in her heart. One afternoon, as Maya and Emma were racing across the field near the slides, Maya saw Mrs. Colby approach Emma with a stern expression. Maya stopped, watching as Mrs. Colby whispered something to her daughter. Emma's shoulders slumped, and her usual cheerful smile faded as she nodded. Mrs. Colby cast a quick look at Maya, then turned on her heel and walked back to her spot under the tree. Emma hesitated, then walked back toward Maya, her eyes a little downcast. The change in her was unmistakable. But Maya tried to brush it off. "Are you okay?" Maya asked gently, sensing her friend's hesitation. Emma gave a small nod but didn't meet her eyes. "Yeah. My mom just wants me to stay closer to her today." Maya felt a sting of disappointment. But she forced a smile. "No problem. We can just play here by the swings." Then, Emma tried to smile back. But her expression was shadowed, as if something else was weighing on her mind. They played for a few more minutes. But it was clear that Emma was distracted. She kept glancing back at her mother. And Maya felt her friend drifting farther and farther away, even though they were standing right beside each other. As the days passed, Emma became more distant. She no longer ran to greet Maya with her usual excitement. And sometimes she even avoided looking at her. They would exchange brief, awkward greetings. But the carefree laughter they'd once shared had been replaced by quiet moments and sidelong glances. Maya's heart ached as she sensed the unspoken barrier that was slowly but steadily building between them. One Saturday afternoon, Maya noticed that Emma and her mother were already at the playground when she arrived. Maya waved as she approached. But Emma barely raised a hand in return. Mrs. Colby's gaze was as cold as ever. And Maya hesitated, feeling the weight of that look as she approached the swings where Emma was standing. "Hi, Emma," Maya said, trying to sound cheerful. But Emma's smile was faint, and her gaze kept drifting to her mother. Suddenly, Mrs. Colby's sharp voice cut through the air, clear and loud. "Emma, come here. Right now." Emma flinched and glanced at Maya with an apologetic look before slowly making her way over to her mother. Mrs. Colby didn't lower her voice as she spoke to her daughter, her words ringing out loud enough for Maya to hear. "I don't want you playing with kids like that. Emma. Do you understand me?" Maya froze, her heart pounding as the words settled over her. She wasn't sure if she had heard right. And for a moment, She thought she might be imagining it. But the look of guilt and discomfort on Emma's face confirmed it. Mrs. Colby's words had been meant for her to hear. A strange numbness filled her, leaving her rooted to the spot, unable to move or speak. Emma looked at Maya for a moment. A flicker of regret in her eyes. But then she turned and walked back to her mother. Mrs. Colby placed a hand on Emma's shoulder, guiding her toward a bench on the other side of the playground. Maya watched them go, feeling a lump form in her throat. The playground suddenly felt unfamiliar, as if it had transformed into a place that no longer welcomed her. She glanced around, hoping to find a friendly face among the other parents. But they were all engaged in their own conversations, their backs turned toward her. No one had intervened. No one had spoken up. That evening, Maya sat on her bed, staring at the wall as the events of the day replayed in her mind. She didn't understand what she had done to deserve such treatment. Mrs. Colby's words had cut deep, leaving her feeling both confused and hurt. Her mother, Grace, noticed the sadness in her eyes as she came in to say goodnight. "Maya, sweetheart, is something bothering you?" her mother asked gently, sitting on the edge of the bed and brushing a stray curl from Maya's forehead. Maya hesitated, unsure of how to explain. She didn't want to worry her parents, and she wasn't even sure if they would understand. She'd never faced anything like this before, and it felt too painful to share. "No, Mom. I'm okay," she mumbled, trying to sound cheerful. But the forced smile didn't reach her eyes. Grace looked at her with concern, but she decided not to press. She leaned down and kissed Maya on the forehead, whispering, "If you ever need to talk, I'm always here for you. Okay?" Maya nodded. But as soon as her mother left the room, her smile faded. She lay back on her pillow, feeling the weight of sadness settle over her. Her mind swirled with questions that had no answers. Why had Mrs. Colby treated her that way? Why had Emma turned away? The hurt in her chest felt like an ache that wouldn't go away. But even as the tears pricked at her eyes, Maya felt a small spark of determination. She couldn't understand what was happening, but she wasn't ready to give up. The playground was her place too, and she wouldn't let anyone take that away from her. As she drifted into a restless sleep, she made a promise to herself: she would return to the playground tomorrow, no matter what happened. She wouldn't let Mrs. Colby's words chase her away from the place she loved. The next afternoon, Maya felt a flutter of nervousness as she approached the playground. Her heart raced as she took each step, her mind filled with the events of the previous day. Part of her wanted to turn back, to avoid the hurt and confusion she knew she might face. But the promise she had made to herself the night before pushed her forward. This was her playground too. She wouldn't let anyone push her away. As Maya arrived, she spotted Emma and Mrs. Colby near the swings, their familiar figures casting long shadows in the late afternoon sun. Emma looked down, her fingers tracing patterns in the sand beneath her feet, while Mrs. Colby's gaze remained steady and unwavering. Her arms crossed over her chest. Maya took a deep breath, lifting her head as she walked toward the swings, feeling the curious glances of other parents and children who had gathered nearby. She felt their eyes on her, but she tried to ignore them, reminding herself of the joy she always felt here. The familiar creak of the swings, the sound of laughter, all of it gave her the courage to stand her ground. Just as she reached for the swing, Mrs. Colby's sharp voice pierced the air, carrying an edge of hostility that made Maya's hand freeze on the chain. "Emma," Mrs. Colby said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Come here. I don't want you near her. Emma looked up, her face stricken with guilt. But she quickly obeyed, standing and walking toward her mother. Mrs. Colby's gaze shifted to Maya, her expression hard and unyielding. You don't belong here, she said coldly, her words clear and cutting. This playground is for other children. Children who don't cause trouble. The word struck Maya like a physical blow. Her heart pounded, and she felt her hands shake as she tightened her grip on the swing chains. She wanted to shout, to tell Mrs. Colby that she had every right to be there, that she had done nothing wrong. But her voice felt trapped. And all she could do was stare back at the woman whose harsh gaze made her feel smaller than ever before. Seeing Maya hesitate, Mrs. Colby took a step forward, her voice dripping with disdain. You're making everyone uncomfortable. Maya, why don't you go play somewhere else? A few parents nearby exchanged glances, but none of them stepped forward. They simply looked away, their expressions guarded. Their silence felt heavy, like an invisible wall that separated Maya from the rest of the playground. She realized with a sinking feeling that no one was going to help her. No one was going to stop Mrs. Colby from driving her away. Summoning every ounce of courage she had, Maya took a step forward, looking up at Mrs. Colby with as much determination as she could muster. I have a right to be here, she said, her voice small but steady. I'm not leaving. Mrs. Colby's eyes narrowed, and a cold smile twisted her lips. Is that so? You think you can just do whatever you please? Without warning, she reached forward, gripping Maya's arm and yanking her back from the swing. The sudden force sent a jolt of pain through Maya's wrist, and she stumbled, barely managing to keep her balance. Hey! Maya cried, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and outrage. Let go of me. But Mrs. Colby only tightened her grip, her expression fierce. You need to learn your place. Maya, she said, her voice icy and unyielding. A few gasps rippled through the crowd as other parents noticed the confrontation. But still, no one moved to intervene. Maya's heart pounded, her mind racing as she struggled to pull free. She felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. And for a brief moment, she wondered if she should just leave. If it would be easier to walk away and avoid the humiliation. But then she remembered the promise she had made to herself. She wouldn't let Mrs. Colby's cruelty define her. She had done nothing wrong, and she deserved to be here as much as anyone else. Summoning all her strength, Maya yanked her arm free, stepping back and lifting her head defiantly. I'm not going anywhere, she said, her voice stronger than before. This playground belongs to everyone. Mrs. Colby's face twisted in anger. And for a moment, it seemed as if she might raise her hand again. But then a small voice spoke up from the crowd, breaking the tense silence. Mrs. Colby. That's enough, a woman's voice said. Maya turned to see one of the mothers. A woman she recognized as Mrs. Ramirez, standing nearby with her arms folded. Her expression was stern as she looked at Mrs. Colby, a flicker of disapproval in her eyes. Mrs. Colby hesitated, her gaze flicking to Mrs. Ramirez. And for the first time, Maya saw a glimmer of uncertainty in her face. Other parents began to murmur, their voices low but filled with a quiet tension. Mrs. Colby's hand dropped to her side, and she took a step back, her confidence faltering. Maya felt a rush of relief and gratitude toward Mrs. Ramirez, who nodded at her with a small smile. Maya's heart swelled with newfound strength, and she took another deep breath, holding her ground. The playground was silent. All eyes on her and Mrs. Colby. For a long moment. No one spoke. Then, without another word, Mrs. Colby turned and walked away. Her face flushed with anger. Emma glanced back at Maya. Her expression filled with regret. But she quickly followed her mother. Her shoulders slumped. As they disappeared from view, Maya felt the weight of the tension lift, replaced by a sense of victory she hadn't expected. She had stood her ground, refusing to let Mrs. Colby's prejudice push her away. Though her wrist still throbbed where Mrs. Colby had grabbed her, Maya felt a spark of pride and resilience that made the pain fade into the background. Mrs. Ramirez approached her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You did the right thing, Maya," she said softly. "You have every right to be here, just like everyone else." Maya nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. For the first time in days, she felt a sense of belonging return to her. A reminder that she wasn't alone in this battle. She looked around at the other parents and children, some of whom smiled at her with encouragement. And she knew that the playground was still hers. As she took her place on the swing, Maya felt a renewed sense of purpose. She would continue to come here, to play and laugh and hold on to the joy that the playground brought her. No matter what happened, she would stand up for herself, just as she had today. And for the first time in a long while, as she kicked her legs and soared high into the sky, Maya felt truly free. After the confrontation with Mrs. Colby, Maya felt a renewed sense of determination. But the incident left a lasting impact on her heart. She was still nervous about going back to the playground, fearing another encounter or more stares. But each time she thought of not returning, a voice in her head reminded her of the promise she'd made to herself: she belonged there. And no one had the right to take that from her. The next day, Maya walked into the playground with her head held high. But her steps were slower, her heart racing as she scanned the area. Emma and Mrs. Colby weren't there, and a part of her felt relieved. She took a deep breath, letting the familiar sounds and sights of the playground calm her nerves. As Maya began to swing, she noticed Mrs. Ramirez sitting on a bench nearby, watching her with a warm smile. A wave of gratitude washed over her as she remembered how Mrs. Ramirez had stood up for her. The strength in that simple gesture made Maya feel that perhaps there were people in the community who were willing to see her for who she truly was. Later that evening, Maya decided to confide in her parents about what had happened. She sat at the kitchen table, nervously tapping her fingers as she waited for her father to come home. Her mother was busy preparing dinner, but Maya could feel her mother's gentle gaze checking on her from time to time, sensing her unease. When her father finally walked through the door, Maya's resolve strengthened. She knew it was time to share everything she had been holding inside. "Dad, can I talk to you and Mom about something?" she asked, her voice small but steady. "Of course, honey," her father replied, his face softening as he took a seat beside her. Her mother joined them, setting down her apron and giving Maya her full attention. Maya took a deep breath, her heart pounding as she recounted the entire incident at the playground, the hurtful words, Mrs. Colby's actions, and the way other parents had just stood by, saying nothing. She spoke quietly, her voice trembling as she remembered the pain of feeling isolated and unwelcome in a place she had once loved so dearly. When she finished, her mother's face was filled with a mixture of anger and sadness, while her father's expression grew serious, his gaze steady as he listened to every word. "My sweet girl," her mother said, pulling Maya into a warm hug. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that. You should never have been made to feel unwelcome or different. You have every right to be at that playground. Maya's father nodded. His voice calm but firm. Maya. I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself. That takes courage. But it's not right for you to face that kind of behavior alone. Your mother and I are here to help. And we'll make sure this never happens again. A sense of relief washed over Maya as she felt the support and love of her parents surround her. She had been so afraid of burdening them. But now she realized they wanted to be there for her. To help her carry the weight of what she had experienced. The following week, her father took action. As a respected federal judge, he was known in the community for his dedication to fairness and justice. And he was determined to make sure no child in their neighborhood would feel the way Maya had. He reached out to other parents, gathering information about Mrs. Colby's behavior and learning that some parents had noticed her attitude toward Maya but hadn't known how to intervene. He organized a community meeting to address the importance of inclusivity and mutual respect within the neighborhood. On the day of the meeting, Maya felt a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. She was nervous about seeing the parents who had stayed silent, about facing the possibility of judgment or indifference. But with her parents by her side, she felt a strength she hadn't known before. The community center was bustling with neighbors, some familiar and others who had always kept to themselves. Maya and her parents took seats near the front. And as she looked around, she spotted Mrs. Colby sitting in the back row, her face set in a rigid expression. Emma was beside her, looking nervous as she cast hesitant glances in Maya's direction. Maya's father, Judge Bennett, stepped to the front of the room. His voice calm but resolute as he began the meeting. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his eyes sweeping over the gathered parents. "I've called this meeting because an incident recently took place at our local playground, a place meant for all our children. My daughter, Maya, was made to feel unwelcome, even unworthy, of being there simply because of the color of her skin. This is not just a playground issue, it's a community issue. And it affects all of us." A hush fell over the room as his words sank in. Maya felt her cheeks flush as she felt the eyes of everyone around her. She held her mother's hand tightly, finding comfort in her steady presence. Judge Bennett continued, detailing the events Maya had described, making sure every parent in the room understood the pain his daughter had endured. He explained how Mrs. Colby had not only belittled Maya but had tried to drive her away. And he challenged everyone in the room to reflect on how they could contribute to a more inclusive community. As he finished speaking, a murmur rippled through the crowd. A young mother stood up, her face filled with sympathy as she looked at Maya. "Maya, I am so sorry," she said, her voice wavering. "I didn't realize this was happening. And I regret that I didn't see how much it hurt you." Another parent, Mr. Wilson, who often brought his son to the playground, added, "We all have a responsibility to create a welcoming environment for every child. I hadn't realized how much pain our silence could cause. I'm sorry, Maya." One by one, more parents voiced their support, expressing regret for not having intervened sooner. Their words washed over Maya, filling her with a sense of hope and belonging she hadn't felt in a long time. But not everyone was so supportive. Maya noticed that Mrs. Colby sat silently, her lips pressed into a tight line as she listened to the parents around her. Eventually, she stood, her gaze defensive as she looked toward Judge Bennett. "I was only trying to protect my child," she said, her voice tense. "No one has the right to judge me for wanting to keep my daughter safe." The room fell silent, tension hanging heavy in the air. Maya's father looked at her calmly, his voice steady as he replied, "Mrs. Colby, Protecting your child should never come at the expense of another child's dignity, he said. Maya has every right to enjoy the playground. Just as much as your daughter or any other child in this neighborhood. She is not a threat. She is a part of this community. And she deserves to be treated with respect and kindness. A murmur of agreement ran through the crowd. Mrs. Colby's face flushed. And she quickly sat down, avoiding the eyes of those around her. Maya felt a surge of relief. Her father's words filling her with a newfound confidence. The meeting ended with an agreement among the parents to foster a more inclusive and supportive environment for all children in the neighborhood. A commitment letter was circulated, affirming the values of respect, fairness, and equality that would guide their community moving forward. A few days after the meeting, Maya returned to the playground. This time, she felt lighter, unburdened by the fear and anxiety that had weighed her down before. Her parents walked with her, offering quiet encouragement as she stepped onto the familiar ground. As she looked around, she saw many of the parents from the meeting, some of whom waved or smiled at her warmly. The playground felt different, no longer a place of isolation, but a space of acceptance and understanding. Emma approached her shyly, her gaze filled with guilt and apology. "Maya. I'm really sorry," she said, her voice soft. "I didn't know how to stand up to my mom. But I never wanted to hurt you." Maya looked at her friend, remembering the pain of their separation, but also feeling the warmth of forgiveness bloom in her heart. She knew Emma had struggled too, and that their friendship was worth fighting for. "It's okay, Emma," Maya said with a gentle smile. "I understand. But from now on, let's make sure no one can pull us apart again." Emma's face lit up with relief, and she nodded eagerly. "Real friends," she said, reaching out her hand. "Real friends." Maya agreed, clasping Emma's hand in her own. They returned to the swings together, laughing as they soared into the sky, the shadow of the past slowly fading. Around them, other children joined in their play, no longer keeping their distance but inviting Maya into their games with open arms. For the first time in a long time, Maya felt the playground return to what it had once been, a place of joy, friendship, and freedom. And as the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the park, Maya looked around at the familiar faces, the smiles and laughter, and knew that she had not only reclaimed her playground but had also discovered her own strength. She would carry that strength with her, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with courage, resilience, and the unwavering support of her family and her community.